Welcome to Retrospect. My name is Steve Heimler, and I'll be your host for this news series here on Heimler's History, where we put today's news headlines in historical context. And we decided to start this series with a topic that thankfully isn't very controversial, namely the tearing down of Confederate monuments. And if you can already taste the sauce like I can, let's get to it. But before we get to it, let me just say one thing about this series. Our goal in all of this is to do what I just said, to put today's headlines in historical context. This is not a series where I'm going to be making political commentary. There is enough of that out there, and if you go searching for it, your cup shall runneth over. But here we're striving to be as apolitical as possible. I want to help you come to your own conclusions and think your own thoughts, because I believe that the heart embraces conclusions that it comes to on its own. Okay, so those are the ground rules. Let's see what's happening with these monuments around the country.
There were cheers Thursday night at the foot of Richmond's Robert E. Lee statue after the governor announced the monument, which stood for 130 years, is coming down. Today, the city's mayor called the decision a victory.
It's a watershed moment, not just for the city of Richmond, the Commonwealth of Virginia, but also for our country. This is akin to the Berlin Wall coming down.
The war heroes of the Confederacy have long lined Richmond's Monument Avenue. The biggest of all, 6 stories high, the statue of General Robert E. Lee has stood since 1890.
Yes, that statue has been there for a long time, but it was wrong then, and it is wrong now.
Republican State Senator Amanda Chase took her frustration to Facebook.
It's all about shoving this down people's throats and erasing the history of the white people.
This is the equivalent to having Hitler's statue in a Jewish community. This part of Portsmouth is predominantly black. Why do we have to come down here and see this?
Okay, so like I said, not even controversial. So how are we supposed to think about all this in a productive way? Let's start with monuments as monuments. I mean, what's the big deal about a statue? Well, a statue is a big deal precisely because of its symbolic value. And I would argue that symbols are more powerful than words, and let me explain. Suppose a person opposes some American policy and goes to a street corner with a sign that says, "I oppose America." Most of us would just pass by that on the street and be like, okay. But suppose that same person, instead of holding up a sign, publicly burns an American flag. If that happens where I live here in the South, then you will hear the collective click of thousands of gun safes being opened all at once. The symbol is way more inflammatory than the words. Or think about it another way. Lots of teachers are protesting going back to school right now in the midst of a pandemic. They're taking to Twitter and other social media platforms to express their disagreement. That's causing a good deal of fighting. But suppose a teacher shot, roasted, and ate a bald eagle on camera as a form of protest. I guarantee you everyone would be freaking out about that. And why is that? Because, like I said, symbols are more potent than words. Or, take it out of the realm of thought experiments and into reality. Suppose Colin Kaepernick had written, "I oppose police brutality" on the back of his football helmet. Everyone would see it and go, yeah, okay. It might create a little stir or something, but I'm guessing not much. But he did not do that. He chose the symbolic gesture of kneeling during the national anthem, and that action inflamed the media. Now, whether you think he was right or wrong to do such a thing, that's beyond my purposes. I'm only trying to prove that the symbolic gesture was way more potent than words could ever be. So, that brings us to monuments. Why is the removal of Confederate monuments so polarizing? It's because they're symbols. To some people, these monuments are symbols of a glorious past and sacrifice and dignity. And to other people, these monuments are symbols of oppression and racism and treason. And if you want to know why this issue gets people so hot, it's because their symbols are being messed with, and that is no small thing. Okay, so with that established, let's move to the second point and consider why people tear down monuments to begin with, and here's where we get into the history of these things. But before we get to Confederate monuments, let's talk about a different monument that I think everyone watching this will agree should have been torn down, because I think it's actually easier to think clearly when we step outside of the current moment where passions are running high. In 1776, a group of New Yorkers gathered to hear the Declaration of Independence read publicly. Now, their first response to such words was to run down to Bowling Green and tear down a statue of King George III. And in a moment of delicious irony, they melted that statue down and forged musket bullets, which they used to shoot British soldiers. Love it. Okay, now just think about that for a second. Do you think it was right to tear that statue down? I'm guessing any American will probably agree that it was. After all, no small part of the Declaration of Independence was a laundry list itemizing Georgia's oppressive turtishness. So, of course, they would tear down the symbol of said oppressive turtishness. What would actually be astonishing is if they left it up. Like, could you imagine going to Bowling Green today and seeing a statue of King George III? I mean, no, that'd be kind of weird. Or maybe go outside of the United States. Were the Russians right for wanting to remove statues of Lenin and Stalin after the fall of the Soviet Union? Or do you agree that after the fall of the Third Reich, Germans were right to rename Adolf Hitler Street to Bahnhof Street? I mean, obviously, right? Okay, so at this point, if you agree with me, then all we've done so far is establish that there are some times when symbols need to be removed. But now let's go one click lower and try to figure out, why is it that those times are so obvious to us? And here is the main argument. Monuments are more about the present than they are about the past. Karen Cox, who's a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, said it like this. Monuments are much more a reflection of those who put them up. They aren't so much about the past as they are a reflection of our values and ideals in the present. That's why they're often so problematic. Now, you may disagree with that. You might actually believe that monuments are more about the past than they are about the present. You might believe even that monuments as monuments are vessels of collective memory and must therefore be preserved. So how should we try to figure this out? Well, to me, if monuments really are about holding collective memory, then it's going to be extremely important for us to know when they were erected and by whom they were erected and why they were erected. Okay, so let's begin with when they were erected. And judging by the many hours I've spent reading on this subject and talking to people, my guess is that for the general public, many people believe that these statues were erected pretty close to the end of the Civil War. And that's exactly what you would think, since so many of these monuments are generals and politicians of the Confederacy. But here's where I tell you, not so much. You know, it's almost like it would be really helpful to see all of this sort of lined up on a visually illuminating chart. Oh, we've got one? Let's look at it. Okay, you can see there's a little spike here at the beginning and the end of the Civil War, and that's probably what you'd expect, and we're steady through Reconstruction. There's a little bit of an uptick at the end of the 19th century, and then what happened? Look at that spike between 1900 and 1920. Why were so many Confederate monuments built during that time? Well, let's think about the broader historical context of that time. Most of these monuments were concentrated in the South for obvious reasons. In 1896, the landmark Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson made it constitutional to segregate the white and black races. And so in the South, they had white schools and they had black schools. They had white sections on the bus and they had black sections on the bus. They had white bathrooms and black bathrooms. So in a social context like that, what would it have meant to put up a giant statue that honored members of the Confederacy? Well, since we've already established that symbols are more powerful than words, I think it's pretty clear what that would have communicated. Now, let's just keep talking about this. When a statue is erected in the Jim Crow South that honors the legacy of the Confederacy, what legacy is that statue honoring? Well, since we're analyzing things in their historical context, we need to go to the sources. And to me, the best place to go is the dedication speeches of these monuments. So, you know, when a statue goes up, it's kind of a big deal. And part of the pageantry of all of it is to give speeches about what that monument honors and what that monument means. So I've got two of these speeches for you, and the first is from the dedication of a monument in 1878 in Augusta, Georgia, and the speaker is Colonel Charles Colcock Jones, and here's what he had to say. With rapturous joy do we hail the dedication of this goodly monument. With kindling hearts do we respond to the inspiration and memories which its presence bespeaks. We glory in the rectitude of the cause and exult in the valor of the men symbolized by its towering form and martial outlines. Okay, see, now that's really nice. Like, that monument was all about honoring the heroic dead of the Civil War. Oh, there's more to it. Oh, well, let's keep reading then. In open day and in the face of the world, we hear protests that so far from being rebels against legitimate authority and traitors to their country, our Confederate dead were lovers of liberty, combatants for constitutional rights, and as examples of heroic virtue, benefactors of their race. Now, I'm going to go ahead and assume that you didn't hear the explosiveness of what he just said there at the end, so let me try to explain it up. First, he said that this monument honors those who fought for their constitutional rights. And pray tell, who were the folks in the South fighting for their constitutional rights during the Civil War? Well, given that the black population had no constitutional rights in the South before and during the Civil War, sounds like he's talking about white Southerners. Second, he honors the Confederate dead as lovers of liberty. Again, who had the liberty in the Confederacy? That was the white population. Add to that, according to the accounts of this dedication, there were something like 10,000 people in attendance, and every last pasty one of them was white. So looking out across a sea of white faces, he ends by saying that those Confederate dead were benefactors of our race. And whose race do you think he's talking about? So according to this speech, this monument was clearly erected as a monument to white supremacy in the post-Reconstruction Jim Crow South. But one source is not enough, so I've got another one for you. In 1913, a monument was dedicated at UNC Chapel Hill called Silent Sam, and a guy named Julian Carr gave the dedication speech, and right in the middle of it, he takes a moment for a personal anecdote, and here's what he said. I trust I may be pardoned for one allusion, howbeit it is rather personal. 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days perhaps after my return from Appomattox, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds, because upon the streets of this quiet village she had publicly insulted and maligned a Southern lady, and then rushed for protection to these university buildings where was stationed a garrison of 100 federal soldiers. I performed the pleasing duty in the immediate presence of the entire garrison, and for 30 nights afterwards slept with a double-barrel shotgun under my head. So get this, at the dedication of Silent Sam, Carr bemoans the fact that after the Civil War was over, he couldn't just horsewhip a black woman like he used to in the good old days. So, at the dedication of this monument, Carr waxes eloquent about how great it was to be able to unleash bitter violence against black people without reprisal. Okay, so those are just two examples, and if we had time, I could give you many more. These statues, according to their dedication speeches, were put there for the exaltation of the white race in the South and the legitimization of power for Southerners who had recently been stripped of their power. Full stop. From the horse's mouth. And I emphasize this because there are some folks who aren't offended by the Confederate monuments, and they're going to say, well, that's not what it means to me. So maybe it's going to be very important to also tell you exactly what the Confederacy stood for in the words of Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy. He gave a speech known as the Cornerstone speech, which he delivered after secession and before the start of the Civil War. And he was laboring to differentiate the principles and morals of the Confederate government over against the Union government. And here's what he said. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea from that of the present abolitionist Union. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. So if you're saying that's not what the Confederacy means to me, well then you're giving it a fundamentally different meaning than those who invested it with meaning to begin with. And you may think I'm trying to be political here and make some argument about tearing monuments down. I'm actually not. I'm just telling you what these monuments mean and what the Confederacy itself meant in the words of those who gave them their meaning. So back to Karen Cox's argument that monuments are far more about the people erecting them than the person or persons memorialized. Monuments are a present tense phenomenon. And if there's an argument about whether a statue should be torn down, that's because the values of the present generation have changed and no longer reflect the values of the generation that put those statues in place. So what are we to do with all of this? I mean, like I said in the beginning, my aim is to remain as politically neutral as possible, but there's no doubt that for some people, a walk through our history has a way of energizing action. So I'm not going to answer the question, should we tear down the monuments? I want you to come to your own conclusions on that. And by the way, this is not just an American conversation. People all over the world are asking these questions. And if you're paying attention to the news, the removal of monuments is everywhere. People are wondering, should they tear down monuments of Winston Churchill in England, or Cecil Rhodes in South Africa, or King Leopold in Belgium? And if you find yourself asking these questions, then let me help you evaluate your answers with a simple rubric. If you agree that monuments tell us far more about the people who erected them than the people they memorialize, then you have a very simple question to answer. Do I agree with the values of the generation who put this monument in place? If you find that you do agree, then I reckon there's nothing to do. But if you find yourself disagreeing, then the next question becomes, okay, then what are we to do with these monuments? I mean, some people want to leave them up because to tear them down will erase a portion of their history, and this isn't actually a very good argument for leaving them up. Revolutionaries tore King George down, and yet somehow the history of America's colonial period was not erased. I think if you find yourself disagreeing with these principles of those who erected the monuments in the first place, then you basically have two options. First, you can tear them down and replace them with monuments to contemporary values. Second, you can augment or add to them. For example, there's a famous statue of a raging bull on Wall Street, which symbolizes the bull market or a growing economy. And when women women wanted to protest their unequal pay as workers in that district, they erected a statue in front of the bull, which was called Fearless Girl. Just by the addition of that little girl, then the original bull takes on new meaning, and you have to stop and you have to think about it for a second. And whether tearing monuments down or augmenting them is a good idea, I'm going to leave that up to you. But now that you know the historical context of these statues, you can stick it in your brain device, crush it, and see what kind of conclusions come out. And just remember, it's much easier to think with your memories than to think about them. And as you start thinking about them, I would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching this first installment of Retrospect. And if you're into this kind of thing, then let us know by subscribing and leaving your thoughts in the comments below, but be nice. And if you think a series like this is important for this generation, then you can join us over on Patreon and support the work that we're doing here. A big thank you to the Paul Family Foundation who provided funding for this episode. I had research help from the incomparable Eileen Bronick, Adam DeToy, and Alistair Paul. This episode was edited by the magnificent Taylor Stone. Thanks for hanging out with me for a bit. Heimler out.